Hi everyone. It is once again Thursday evening, and we will once again be delving into the first book of the Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. And we're still in the section of the Mysteries of Great Cities. Excellent. Orczy, I will never get her name right. But that is what we're doing tonight. Because that's what we do on Thursdays. Tomorrow, I will be doing another book. Hopefully, I'll get a chance to do a new background to set it. There's no guarantee. Because honestly, I've been busy trying to get things cleaned up around the house, so. I don't know, I may just rearrange a few things. I don't know. I honestly haven't put much thought into it until other than knowing which book I was going to read. But basically, this book will be taking over our fairy tales for the Halloween season. They are longer stories, and they are slightly scarier. Yes, far as scary as fairy tales can get. I have not decided if what I'm going to do for what am I thinking? Subathon. Yeah, one of those things. I am going to go ahead and have Kel post stuff real quick. If I can find it. Okay, there's a September message. I mean, she's got it on her timers, but let's go get posted. Because it is September, and honestly, I could use all the money I can get. So, I guess I need to fix it on this one too. Some of my chat windows. And then she just automatically posted anyway. Because, of course. Let's go ahead and switch over to the study. So I'll probably have to fix the chat message there too. Okay. I'm going to hide its chat. So it'll be in the regular chat window, but it won't be on the on-screen chat. Why am I small in my chair again? Okay, there we go. Again, if the pinned message is taking up too much space on your screen. Hey, Guilty, how you doing? Ugh. Oh yeah, haven't gotten started in the stories yet. You're on your way to work. Well, I hope you have a good evening at work. I'm doing a couple more mysteries tonight. Probably just get 2 stories read. Oh, there's, I think, 3 more of the author. Yeah, there's 3 more mysteries by this author. I'll get 2 of them done, and if I'm feeling good, I'll go and do the 3rd one. Yes, thank you for coming in. And even if you're lurking, we do appreciate you being here. Oh, excuse me. And hopefully I will not mumble my way through some of the stories of this one, because I noticed while doing the VODs last week, I really did just fumble through a lot. But let's go ahead and get into it, since, you know, we might as well. So everyone, settle back, get comfortable, and get ready for the stories. I do have to check something. Okay, desktop audio is not over yet. Should also mean my sound alerts are working. Excuse me. Now let's get into the Edinburgh Mystery. The man in the corner had not enjoyed his lunch. I could see that he had something on his mind, for even before he began the talk that morning, he was fidgeting with his bit of string. And settling all my nerves on charge. Have you ever felt real sympathy with a criminal or thief? He asked after a while. Only once, I think, I replied. And then I'm not quite sure that it was the unfortunate woman who did enlist my sympathies was the criminal you make her out to be. You mean the heroine of the new mystery? He replied blandly. I know that you tried very hard that time to discredit the only possible version of that mysterious murder, the version which is my own. Now, I am equally sure that you will have at the present moment no more notion as to who killed and robbed poor Lady Donaldson in Charlotte Square, Edinburgh, than the police have themselves. And yet you are fully prepared to pooh-pooh my arguments, and to disbelieve my version of the mystery. Such is a lady journalist's mind. If you have some cock-and-bull story to explain that extraordinary case, I retorted, of course I shall disbelieve it. Certainly, if you're going to try and enlist my sympathies on behalf of Edith Crawford, I can assure you that you won't succeed. Thank you for the hydrate. Well, I don't know that that is altogether my intention. I see you are interested in the case, but I dare say you don't remember all the circumstances. You must forgive me if I repeat that which you already know. If you have ever been to Edinburgh at all, you will have heard of Graham's Bank and Mr. Andrew Graham, the present head of the firm. He's undoubtedly one of the most prominent nobilities of the modern Athens. The man in the corner took 2 or 3 photos from his photo book and placed them before me, then pointed at them with his long bony finger. That, he said, is Mr. Elphinstone Graham, the eldest son, a typical young Scotchman, as you see, and this is David Graham, the second son. I looked closely over his last photo and saw before me a young face, upon which some lasting sorrow seemed already to have left its mark. The face was delicate and thin, the pinched features, and the eyes seemed almost unnaturally large and prominent. "He was deformed," commented the man in the corner in answer to my thoughts. "And, as such, an object of pity and even the repugnance of most of his friends. There was also a good deal of talk in Edinburgh society as to his mental condition, his mind, according to many intimate friends of the Grahams, being at times decidedly unhinged. But, that as it may, I fancy that his life must have been a very sad one. He had lost his mother when quite a baby, and his father seemed, strangely enough, to have an almost unconquerable dislike towards him. Everybody got to know presently of David Graham's sad position in his father's own house, and also of his great affection lavished upon him by his godmother, Lady Donaldson, who was the sister of Mr. Graham's. She was a lady of considerable wealth, being the widow of Sir George Donaldson, the great distiller, but she seems to have been decidedly eccentric. Latterly, she had astonished all her family, who were rigid Presbyterians, by announcing her intention of embracing the Roman Catholic faith, and then retiring to the convent of St. Augustine's at New Abbots in Devonshire. She had a sole and absolute control of the vast fortune the doting husband had bequeathed to her. Clearly, therefore, she was at liberty to bestow it upon a Devonshire convent if she chose. But this evidently was not altogether her intention. I told you how fond she was of her deformed godson, did I not? Being a bundle of eccentrics, she had many hobbies, none more pronounced than the fixed determination to see, before retiring from the world altogether, David Graham happily married. Now it appears that David Graham, ugly, deformed, half demented as he was, had fallen desperately in love with Miss Edith Crawford, the daughter of the late Dr. Crawford of Prince's Gardens. The young lady, however, very naturally perhaps, thought shy of David Graham, who about the time certainly seemed very queer and morose, but Lady Donaldson, with characteristic determination, seems to have made up her mind to melt Miss Crawford's heart towards her unfortunate nephew. On October the 2nd, at a family party given by Mr. Graham in his fine mansion in Charlotte Square, Lady Donaldson openly announced her intention of making over, by deed of gift to her nephew, David Graham, certain property, money and shares, amounting in the total value to the sum of £100,000, and also her magnificent diamonds, which were said to be worth £50,000, for the use of, she said, David's wife. Keith McFinley, a lawyer of Prince Street, received the next day instructions of drawing up the necessary deed of gift, which she pledged herself to sign the day of her godson's wedding. A week later, the Scotsman contained the following paragraph. A marriage is arranged, and will shortly take place between David, younger son of Andrew Graham, Esquire, of Charlotte Square, Edinburgh, and Durstnakirk, Perthend, and Edith Lillian, only surviving daughter of the late Dr. Kenneth Crawford, of Prince's Gardens. In Edinburgh society, comments were loud and various upon the forthcoming marriage, and on the whole, comments were far from complimentary to the families concerned. I do not think that the Scotch are a particularly sentimental race, but there was such obvious buying, selling, and bargaining about this marriage that Scottish chivalry rose in revolt at the thought. Against that, the three people most concerned seemed perfectly satisfied. David Graham was positively transformed. His moroseness was gone from him, he lost his queer ways and wild manners, and became gentle and affectionate in the midst of his great and unexpected happiness. Miss Edith Crawford ordered her trousseau and talked of the diamonds to her friends. Lady Donaldson was only waiting for the consummation of the marriage, her heart's desire, before she finally retired from the world, at peace with it and with herself. The deed of gift was ready for the signature on the wedding day, which was fixed for November 7th, and Lady Donaldson took up her abode temporarily in her brother's house in Charlotte Square. Mr. Graham gave a large ball on October 23rd. Special interest was attracted to this ball from the fact that this occasion Lady Donaldson insisted that David's future wife should wear the magnificent diamonds which were soon to be hers. They were, it seems, superb, and became Miss Crawford's stately beauty to perfection. The ball was a brilliant success, the last guest leaving at 4 a.m. The next day it was a universal topic of conversation, and the day after that, when Edinburgh unfolded the late editions of the morning papers, it learned the horror and dismay that Lady Donaldson had been found murdered in her room, and that the celebrated diamonds had been stolen. Hardly had the beautiful little city, however, recovered from this awful shock, than its newspapers had another thrilling sensation ready for their readers. Already all Scots and English papers had mysteriously hinted at startling information obtained by the procurator fiscal, and at an impending sensational arrest. Then the announcement came, and everyone in Edinburgh read, horror-struck and aghast, that the sensational arrest was none other than that of Miss Edith Crawford, for murder and robbery, both so daring and horrible that reasons refused to believe that the young lady, born and bred in the best social circle, could have conceived, much less executed, so heinous a crime. She had been arrested in London at the Midland Hotel and brought to Edinburgh, where she was judiciously examined, and bail was refused. Yes, we all hold the fancy balls back then. Part 2. Little more than a fortnight after that, Edith Crawford was duly committed to stand her trial before the High Court of the Judiciary. She had pleaded not guilty at the pleading night, and her defense was entrusted to Sir James Fenwick, one of the most eminent advocates at the criminal bar. Strange to say, continued the man in the corner after a while, public opinion from what the first went dead against this accused. The public was absolutely like a child, perfectly irresponsible and wholly illogical. It argued that since Miss Crawford had already been in the marriage contract with a half-demented, deformed creature for the sake of the £100,000, she must have been equally ready to murder and rob the old lady for the sake of £50,000 worth of jewelry, without the encumbrance of so undesirable a husband. Perhaps the great sympathy roused in the popular mind of David Graham had much to do with his ill feeling against the accused. David Graham had, by this cruel and dastardly murder, lost the best, if not the only, friend he possessed. He had also lost in one fell swoop the large fortune which Lady Donaldson had been about to assign to him. The deed of gift had never been signed, and the old lady's vast wealth, instead of enriching her favourite nephew, was distributed, since she had made no will, amongst her heirs-in-law. And now, to crown the long chapter of sorrow, David Graham saw that the girl he loved accused of an awful crime which had robbed him of his friend and his fortune. It was therefore with an unmistakable thrill that the righteous satisfaction that the Edinburgh Society saw this mercenary girl in a terrible plight. I was immensely interested in the case and journeyed down to Edinburgh in order to get a view of the chief actors of the thrilling drama which was about to be unfolded there. I succeeded, I generally do, in securing one of the front seats in the audience, and was already comfortably installed in my place in court when through the trap door I saw the head of a prisoner emerge. She was very becomingly distressed in deep black, and, led by 2 policemen, she took her place at the dock. Sir James Fenwick took hands with her very warmly, and I could almost hear him instilling words of comfort to her. The trial lasted 6 clear days, during which time more than 40 persons were examined for the prosecution, and as many for the defense. But the most interesting witnesses were certainly the 2 doctors, the maid Tremlett Campbell, and the High Street jeweller, and David Graham. There was, of course, a great deal of medical evidence to go through. Poor Lady Donaldson had been found with a silk scarf tied tightly around her neck, her face showing even in the inexperienced eye every symptom of strangulation. Then Tremlett, Lady Donaldson's confidential maid, was called. Closely examined by the Crown Counsel, she gave an account of the ball of Charlotte Square on the 23rd, and the wearing of the jewels by Miss Crawford on that occasion. "I helped Miss Crawford on with the tiara of her hair," she said, "and my lady put the 2 necklaces round Miss Crawford's neck herself. And there were also some beautiful brooches, bracelets, and earrings. At 4 o'clock in the morning, when the ball was over, Miss Crawford brought the jewels back to the lady's room. My lady had already gone to bed, and I had put out the electric light, and I was going too. There was only 1 candle left in the room, and it was close to the bed. Miss Crawford took all the jewels off and asked Lady Donaldson for the key to the safe so that she might put them away. My lady gave her the key and said to me, 'You can go to bed, Tremlett, and you must be dead tired.' I was glad to go, for I could hardly stand up, I was so tired. I said 'Good night' to my lady and also to Miss Crawford, who was busy putting away the jewels. I was going out of the room. I heard Lady Donaldson saying, 'Have you managed it, my dear?' And Miss Crawford said, 'I've put everything away very nicely.'" And as it's James Fenwick, Tremlett said that Lady Donaldson always carried the key in her jewel safe on a ribbon around her neck, and had done so the whole day preceding her death. "On the night of the 24th, she continued, Lady Donaldson was still rather tired and went up to her room directly after dinner, and while the family was still sitting in the dining room. She made me dress her hair, then she slipped on her dressing gown and sat in an armchair with a book. She told me that she felt strangely uncomfortable and nervous and could not account for it. However, she did not want me to sit with her, so I thought that the best thing I could do was to tell Mr. David Graham that her ladyship did not seem very cheerful. Her ladyship was so fond of Mr. David, it always made her happy to have him with her. Then I went to my room at 8:30, and Mr. David called to me. Said, 'Your mistress does seem a little restless tonight. If I were you, I would just go and listen to her at the door for an hour's time, and if she has gone to bed, I would go away and stay with her until she was.' At about 10 o'clock, I did as Mr. David suggested and listened at her ladyship's door. However, all was quiet in the room, and, thinking her ladyship had gone to sleep, I went back to bed. The next morning at 8 o'clock, when I took my mistress's cup of tea, I saw her lying on the floor, her poor dear face all purple and distorted. I screamed, and the other servants came rushing along. Then Mr. Graham had the door locked and sent for the doctor and the police. The poor woman seemed to find it very difficult not to break down. She was closely questioned by Sir James Fenwick, but had nothing further to say. She had seen her mistress alive at 8 o'clock in the evening on the 24th. "And then you listened at her door at 10 o'clock, asked Sir James. "Did you try to open it?" "I did, but it just locked," she replied. "Did Lady Donaldson usually lock her bedroom at night?" "Nearly always." "And in the morning when you took her tea?" "The door was open. I walked straight in." "Are you quite sure?" insisted Sir James. "Oh, swear it," solemnly answered the woman. After that, we were informed by several members of Mr. Graham's establishment that Miss Crawford had been in a tea to Charlotte Square in the afternoon of the 24th. That she told everyone she was going to London by the night mail, and she had some special shopping she wished to do there. It appears that Mr. Graham and David both tried to persuade her to stay for dinner, and then to go by the 9:10 p.m. from the Selonian station. Miss Crawford, however, had refused, saying that she always preferred to go with the Waverley station. It was near to her own rooms, and she still had a good deal of writing to do. In spite of these, 2 witnesses saw the accused in Charlotte Square later on in the evening. She was carrying a big bag which seemed heavy and was walking towards the Caledonian railway station. But the most thrilling moment in that sensational trial was reached on the second day, when David Graham, looking wretchedly ill, unkempt and haggard, stepped into the witness box. A murmur of sympathy went round the audience at the sight of him, who was the second, perhaps, most deeply stricken victim of the Charlotte Square tragedy. David Graham, in answer to the Crown Counsel, gave an account of his last view with Lady Donaldson. She told me she had seemed anxious and upset, and I went to have a chat with her. She soon cheered up, and the unfortunate young man hesitated visibly, but after a while resumed with obvious effort. She spoke of my marriage and of the gift she was about to bestow upon me. She said the diamonds would be for my wife, and after that, for my daughter, if I had one. She also complained that Mr. McFinley had been so punctilious about declaring the deed a gift, and that it was a great pity for £100,000 to just pass from her hands to mine without so much fuss. I stayed talking with her for about half an hour. Then I left her, as she seemed ready to go to bed, and I told her maid to listen at the door in about an hour's time. There was a deep silence in the court for a few moments, a silence which to me seemed almost electrical. If some time before it was uttered, the next question put by the Crown Counsel to the witness had hovered in the air. You were engaged to Miss Elizabeth Crawford at one time, were you not? One felt, rather than heard, the most inaudible yes which escaped from David Graham's compressed lips. Under what circumstances was the engagement broken off? Sir James Fenwick had already risen in protest, but David Graham had been the first to speak. I do not think that I need to answer that question. I will put it in a different form, then, said the Crown Counsel urbanely. One to which my learned friend cannot possibly take an exception. Did you, or did you not, on October 27th, receive a letter from the accused, in which she desired to be released from her promise of marriage to you? Again, David Graham would have refused to answer, and he certainly gave no audible reply to the learned counsel's question. But everyone in the audience there present, aye, every member of the jury and of the bar, read upon David Graham's pale countenance and large, sorrowful eyes that ominous yes, which he failed to reach his trembling lips. Part 3. There was no doubt, continued the man in the corner, that what little sympathy the young girl's terrible position had aroused in the public mind had died out the moment that David Graham left the witness box on the second day of the trial. Whether Edith Crawford was guilty of murder or not, the callous way in which she had attempted and accepted her deformed lover, and then had thrown him over, had set everyone's mind against her. It was Graham himself who had been the first to put the prosecutor fiscal in the position of the fact that the accursed had written to David from London, breaking off her engagement. This information had, no doubt, directed the attention of the fiscal to Miss Crawford, and the police soon brought forward the evidence which had led her to arrest. We had a fiscal sensation on the third day when Mr. Campbell, jeweller of High Street, gave his evidence. He said that on October 25th, a lady came to his shop and offered to sell him a pair of diamond earrings. Trade had been very bad, and he had refused the bargain, although the lady seemed ready to part with the earrings for an extraordinarily low sum, considering the beauty of the stones. In fact, it was because of this evident desire on the lady's part to sell at any cost that he had looked at her more keenly than he otherwise would have done. He was now ready to swear that the lady that offered him the diamond earrings was the prisoner in the dock. I can assure you that as we listened to this apparently damnatory evidence, you might have heard a pin drop amongst the audience in the crowded court. The girl alone, there in the dock, remained calm and unmoved. Remember that for 2 days we had heard evidence to prove that old Dr. Crawford had died having his daughter penniless, that having no mother she had been brought up by a maiden aunt, who had trained her to be a governess, which occupation she had followed for several years, and that she certainly had never been known by any of her friends to be in the possession of solitaire diamond earrings. The prosecution had certainly secured an ace of trumps, but Sir James Fenwick, who during the whole of that day had seemed to take little interest in the proceedings, here rose from his seat, and I knew at once that he had got a titbit in the way of a point up his sleeve. Gaunt and usually tall, and with his beak-like nose, he always looks strangely impressive when he seriously tackles a witness. He did it at this time of the vengeance, I can tell you. He was all over the pompous little jewel in a moment. Had Mr. Campbell made a special entry in his book as to the visit of the lady in question? No. Had he any special means of ascertaining when the visits did actually take place? No, but what record had he of the visit? Mr. Campbell had none. In fact, after about 20 minutes of cross-examination, he had to admit that he had given but little thought to the interview with the lady at the time, and certainly not with connection to the murder of Lady Donaldson until he had read the papers that the young lady had been arrested. Then he and his clerk talked in the matter over, it appears, together, and had certainly recollected that the lady had brought some beautiful earrings for sale on a day which must have been the very morning after the murder. If Sir James Fenwick's object was to discredit the special witness, he certainly gained his point. All the pomposity went out of Mr. Campbell. He became flustered, and then excitedly when he lost his temper. After that he was allowed to leave the court, and Sir James Fenwick resumed his seat and waited, like a vulture for its prey. It presented itself in the person of Mr. Campbell's clerk, who, before the procurator Fesco, had cooperated his employer's evidence in every respect. In Scotland, no witness in any one case is present in court during the examination of another, and Mr. McFarlane, the clerk, was, therefore, quite unprepared for the pitfalls which Sir James Fenwick had prepared for him. He tumbled into them, head foremost, and with the eminent advocates turned him inside out like a glove. Mr. McFarlane did not lose his temper. He was far too humble a frame of mind to do that. But he got into a hopeless quagmire of mixed recollections, and he too left the witness box quite unprepared to swear to the day of the interview with the lady with the diamond earrings. I dare say, mind you, continued the man in the corner with a chuckle, that to most people present, Sir James Fenwick's cross-questioning seemed completely irrelevant. Both Mr. Campbell and his clerk were quite ready to swear that they had an interview concerning some diamond earrings with a lady, of whose identity with the accused they were perfectly well convinced. And to the casual observer, the question as to the time or even the day when the interviews took place could make but little difference in the ultimate issue. Now I took in a moment, the entire drift of Sir James Fenwick's defense for Edith Crawford. When Mr. McFarlane left the witness box, the second victim of the advocate's caustic tongue, I could read in the book the whole history of the crime, and its investigation and the mistakes made by the police first and the public prosecution afterwards. Sir James Fenwick knew them too, of course, and he placed a finger upon every one, demolishing, like a child who blows upon a house of cards, the entire scaffolding erected by the prosecution. Mr. Campbell's and Mr. McFarlane's identification of the accused with a lady who, on some date, admitted to be uncertain, had tried to sell a pair of diamond earrings was the first point. Sir James had plenty of witnesses to prove that on the 25th, the day after the murder, the accused was in London, whilst the day before Mr. Campbell's shop had been closed long before the family circle had last seen the Lady Donaldson. Clearly the jeweller and his clerk must not have seen her, and some other lady whom their vivid imagination had pictured being identical to the accused. Then came the great question of time. Mr. David Graham had been evidently the last to see Lady Donaldson alive. He had spoken to her as late as 8:30 p.m. Sir James Fenwick had called 2 porters of the Caledonian Railway Station, who testified to Miss Crawford having taken her seat in a first-class carriage at 9:10 train, some minutes before it started. It was conceivable argued Sir James, that in place of a half an hour the accused, a young girl, could have found her way surreptitiously into the house at a time in which the entire household was still astir, that she would have strangled Lady Donaldson, forced open the safe, and made away with the jewels. A man, an experienced burglar, might have done it, but I contend that the accused is physically incapable of accomplishing such a feat. With regard to the broken engagement, continued the eminent counsel with a smile, it may have seemed a little heartless, certainly, but heartlessness is no crime in the eyes of the law. The accused had stated in her declaration at the time that she wrote to Mr. David Graham, breaking off her engagement, that she heard nothing of the Edinburgh tragedy. The London papers had reported the crime very briefly. The accused was very busy shopping. She knew nothing of Mr. David Graham's altered position. In no case was breaking off the engagement a proof that the accused had obtained possession of the jewels by so foul a deed. Of course, it is impossible for me, continued the man in the corner apologetically, to give you any idea of the eminent advocate's eloquence and the masterful logic. It has struck every one, I think, just as it did me, that he chiefly directed the attention to the fact that there was absolutely no proof against the accused. Be that as it may, the result of the remarkable trial was a verdict of non-proven. The jury were absent 40 minutes, and it appears that in the mind of all of them there remained, in spite of Sir James's arguments, a firmly rooted conviction. Call it instinct, if you like, that Lady Edith Crawford had done away with Lady Donaldson in order to become possessed of those jewels, and that in spite of the pompous jeweller's many contradictions, she had offered him some of those diamonds for sale. But there was not enough proof to convict, and she was even given the benefit of the doubt. I have heard English people argue that in England she would have been hanged. Personally, I doubt that. I think that an English jury, not having the judicial loophole of not proven, would have been bound to acquit her. What do you think? Part 4. There was a silence between us for a few moments, for I did not reply immediately, and he went on making impossible knots with his bits of string. Then I said, I think that I agree with those English people who say that the English jury would have condemned her. I have no doubt that she was guilty. She may not have committed the awful deed herself. Someone in Charlotte Square house may have been her accomplice and killed and robbed Lady Donaldson while Edith Crawford waited outside for the jewels. David Graham left his godmother at 8:30. If the accomplice was one of the servants of the house, he or she would have had plenty of time for any amount of villainy, and Edith Crawford could have yet caught the 9:10 train from Caledonian Station. Then who, in your opinion, yes, sarcastically and cocking his funny bird-like head to the side, tried to sell the diamond earrings to Mr. Campbell, the jeweller? Edith Crawford, of course, I retorted triumphantly. He and his clerk both recognized her. When did she try to sell the earrings? Ah, that is what I cannot quite make out, and there, to my mind, lies the only mystery in the case. On the 25th she certainly was in London, and it is not very likely that she could go back to Edinburgh in order to dispose of the jewels there, where they could most easily be traced. Not very likely, certainly. he assented dryly. And, I added, on the day before she left for London, Lady Donaldson was alive. And pray, he said suddenly, with the comic complacency he surveyed a beautiful knot he had just twisted up between his long fingers. What has the fact got to do with it? But it has everything to do with it, I reported. Ah, there you go. He sighed with comic infinity. My teachings don't seem to have improved your powers of reasoning. You are as bad as the police. Lady Donaldson has been robbed and murdered, and you immediately argue that she was robbed and murdered by the same person. But, I argued. There is no but, he said, getting more and more excited. See how simple it is. Edith Crawford wears the diamonds one night, then she brings them back to Lady Donaldson's room. Remember the maid's statement? My lady said, have you put them back, my dear? A simple statement utterly ignored by the prosecution. But what did it mean? That Lady Donaldson could not see for herself whether Edith Crawford put back the jewels or not, since she asked the question. Then you argue? I never argue, interrupted excitedly. I state undeniable facts. Edith Crawford wanted to steal the jewels, took them then and there. Then she had the opportunity. Why in the world should she have waited? Lady Donaldson was in bed, and Tremlett, the maid, had gone. The next day, namely the 25th, she tries to dispose of a pair of earrings to Mr. Campbell, and she fails, and decides to go to London, where she has a better chance. Sir James Fenwick did not think it desirable to bring forward witnesses to prove that, have since ascertained a fact, namely, that on the 27th of October, 3 days before her arrest, Lady Crawford crossed over to Belgium, and came back to London the next day. In Belgium, no doubt, Lady Donaldson's diamonds, taken out of their settings, calmly repose at this moment, while the money derived from their sale is safely deposited in a Belgian bank. But then you murdered Lady Donaldson, and why? I gasped. It was a daring, brutal murder, remember? Think of one who, not being the thief himself, would nevertheless have the strongest of all motives to shield the thief from the consequences of her own misdeeds. Since it would possibly be absolutely logical, nay, impossible, that he should be an accomplice. Surely, I gasped. Think of a curious nature, warped morality as well as physical. Do you know how those natures feel? 1,000 times more strongly than even straight natures in everyday life. Then think of such a nature being brought face to face with this awful problem. Do you think that for such nature would hesitate a moment before committing a crime to save the loved one from the consequences of a deed? Mind you, I don't ascertain for a moment that David Graham had any intention of murdering Lady Donaldson. Tremlett tells him that she seemed strangely upset. He goes to her room and finds out that she discovered that she had been robbed. She naturally suspects Edith Crawford, recollects the incidents of the night before, and probably expresses her feelings to David Graham, and threatens imminent persecution. Scandal, what you will. I repeat it again. I dare say he had no wish to kill her. Probably he merely threatened to. A medical gentleman who spoke of a sudden heart failure was no doubt right. Then imagine David Graham's remorse, his horror, and his fears. An empty safe probably is the first object that suggests to him the grim tableau of robbery and murder, which he arranges in order to ensure his own safety. But remember one thing. No miscreant was ever seen to enter or leave the house surreptitiously. The murderer left no signs of entrance and none of exit. An armed burglar would have left some trace. Someone would have heard something. Then who blocked and unlocked Lady Donaldson's door that night while she herself lay dead? Someone in the house, I tell you. Someone who left no trace. Someone against whom there would be no suspicion. Someone who killed without apparently the slightest premeditation and without the slightest motive. Think of it. I know I am right, and then tell me if I have enlisted all your sympathies in the author of the Edinburgh murders. And he was gone. I looked again at the photo of David Graham. Did a crooked mind really dwell in that crooked body? And were there in the world such crimes that were great enough to be deemed sublime? Okay, so the godson did it. A murder in a way. Interesting, isn't it? I mean, that absolutely makes sense with the way he explained it. Let's see how we're doing with time. I'm going to go ahead and hit the ads, so the next story doesn't get our trouble. So, everyone get up, stretch, do stuff if you need to. Ugh. Welcome back. I don't know. So let's get into the second story. from the mainland and going to the small one. 4. The Dublin Mystery. I always thought the history of that forge was all about the interesting as I had read, said the man in the corner that day. He had been silent for some time, and was meditative and sorting and looking through a packet of small photographs in his pocketbook. I guessed that some of these would presently be placed before me in my inspection, and I had not long to wait. That is old Brooks, he said, pointing to one of the photographs. Millionaire Brooks, as he was called, and these are his 2 sons, Percival and Murray. It was a curious case, wasn't it? Personally, I don't wonder that the police were completely at sea. If a member of that highly estimable force happened to be as clever as a clever author that forged will, we would have very few undetected crimes in this country. That is why I always try to persuade you to give our poor ignorant police the benefit of your great insight and wisdom, he said. I know, he said blandly. You have been most kind in that way, but I am only an amateur. Crime interests me only when it resembles a clever game of chess, with many intricate moves which all tend to one solution, and checkmating to the antagonist, the detective forces of the country. Now, confess that in the Dublin Mystery, the clever police were absolutely checkmated. Absolutely. Just as the public was. There are actually 2 crimes there which have completely baffled detection. The murder of Patrick Weatherford, the lawyer, and the forged will of millionaire Brooks. There are not many millionaires in Ireland. No wonder old Brooks was notably in his way, since his business, bacon curing, I believe it is said to be worth over £2 million of solid money. His younger son Murray was a refined, highly educated man, and was moreover the apple of his father's eye, as he was a spoilt darling of Dublin society. Good-looking, a splendid dancer, and a perfect writer, he was the acknowledged catch of the matrimonial market in Ireland, and many an aristocratic house was openly hospitable to the favoured son of a millionaire. Hey, Michael. What up to you? Ooh, just go silent. Cool. Let's say you have a good stream. No, thank you. So if you need to go get a drink or anything, or raid and dash, feel free to. Yep. We do have a lot of readers that just don't get recognized. It'd be nice if we could get our own subjects and like live reading, but I use reading fun. Some other people use ASMR. Hey, Squall. I'd forgotten to put that for the subscribing sound. They're just getting into the second story. Haven't gotten in too far, so. This one's a Dublin Mystery. As Parcel Brooks, the eldest son, would inherit the bulk of the old man's property, and also probably the larger share in the business. He, too, was a good-looking man, more so than his brother. He, too, rode, danced, and talked well, but it was many years ago that mamas with marriageable daughters had given up all hopes of Percival Brooks as a profitable son-in-law. That young man's infatuation for Maisie Fortescue, a lady of undoubted charm, but was very doubtful antecedents, had astonished the London and Dublin music halls with her extravagant dances, was too well known and too old established to encourage any hopes of other quarters. Whether Percival Brooks would ever marry Maisie Fortescue was thought to be very doubtful. Old Brooks had the full disposal of all his wealth, and it would have faced ill with Percival if he had introduced the undesirable wife into the magnificent Fitzwilliam Place establishment. That is how matters stood, continued the man in the corner, when Dublin society one morning learnt with deep regrets and dismay that old Brooks had died very suddenly at his residence after only a few hours' illness. At first it was generally understood that he had had an apoplectic stroke. Anyway, he had had business hale and hearty as ever the day before his death, which occurred late on the evening of December 1st. It was in the morning papers of December 2nd which told the sad news to their readers, and it was those self-same papers which on the eventful morning contained another, even more startling piece of news which proved the prelude to a series of sensations, such as the tranquil, placid Dublin had not experienced for many years. This was, that on the very afternoon which saw the death of Dublin's greatest millionaire, Mr. Patrick Weatherd, his solicitor, was murdered in Phoenix Park at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, while actually walking on his own house from his visit to his client at Fitzwilliam Place. Patrick Weatherd was well known as a proverbial town pump. A mysterious and tragic death filled all Dublin with dismay. The lawyer, who was a man 60 years of age, had been struck on the back of the head with a heavy stick, garroted, and subsequently robbed, for neither money, watch, nor pocketbook were found on his person. Whilst the police soon gathered from Patrick Weathered's household that he had left home about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, carrying both watch and pocketbook, and undoubtedly money as well. The inquest was held, and a verdict was willful murder was found against some person or persons unknown. But Dublin had not exhausted its stock of sensations yet. Millionaire Brooks had been buried with due pomp and magnificence, as his will had been placed, his business and personally belongings estimated to £2.5 million, but Percival Gordon Brooks, his eldest son and sole executor. The younger son, Murray, who had devoted the best years of his life to being a friend and companion to his father, while Percival ran over ballet dancers and music hall stars, Murray, who had vowed to be the apple of his father's eye in consequence, was left with a miserly pittance of £300 a year, and no share whatsoever in the gigantic businesses of Brooks and Sons, bacon cutters of Dublin. Something had evidently happened within the precincts of the Brooks town mansion, which the public in Dublin society tried in vain to fathom. Elderly mammas and blushing debutantes were already thinking of the best means whereby to next season they might more easily show the cold shoulder to young Murray Brooks, who had so suddenly become hopeless, detrimental in the market. when all these sensations terminated in one gigantic, overwhelming bit of scandal, for the next 3 months furnished food for gossip in every drawing room in Dublin. Mr. Murray Branks, namely, had entered a claim for probate of a will by his father in 1891, declaring that the later will, made the very day of his father's death, was proved by his brother as sole executor to be null and void, that will being a forgery. Part 2. The facts that transpired in connection with the extraordinary case were sufficiently curious to puzzle everybody. As I told you before, all Mr. Brooks' friends never quite grasped the idea that an old man should have so completely cut off his favorite son with the proverbial shilling. You see, Percival had always been a thorn in the old man's flesh. Horse racing, gambling, theaters, and music halls were, in the old pork butcher's eyes, so many deadly sins which his son committed every day of his life, and all the Fitzwilliam Place household testify that to the many and bitter quarrels which had risen between father and son over the latter's gambling or racing debts. Many people asserted that Brooks would have sooner have left his money to charitable institutions and see it squandered upon the brightest star that adorned the music hall stage. The case came up for hearing early in the spring. In the meanwhile, Percival Brooks had given up his racehorse associates, settling down in Fitzwilliam Place mansion, and conducted his father's business without a manager, but with all the energy and forethought which he had previously devoted to more unworthy causes. Murray had elected not to stay in the old house. No doubt associations were too painful and recent in nature. He was boarding with the family of Mr. Wilson Hibbert, who was the late Patrick Weathers, the murdered lawyer's partner. They were quiet, homely people who lived in a little pocky over the house over in Kinney Street. Poor Murray must, in spite of his grief, have felt very bitterly the change of the luxurious quarters in his father's mansion to his present tiny room and homely meals. Percival Brooks, who was now drawing an income of over $100,000 a year, was very severely criticized for adhering so strictly to the letter of his father's will, not only paying his brother a paltry £300 a year, which was literally but the crumbs of his own magnificent dinner table. The issue of that consistent case, which therefore waited in eager interest. In the meanwhile, the police, who at first seemed fairly loquacious on the subject of the murder of Mr. Patrick Weatherd, suddenly became strangely reticent, and by their very reticence aroused a certain amount of uneasiness in the public mind, until one day the Irish Times published the following extraordinary, enigmatic paragraph. We hear on authority, we cannot be questioned, that certain extraordinary developments are expected in connection with the brutal murder of our distinguished townsman, Mr. Weatherd. The police, in fact, are vainly trying to keep it secret, that they hold a clue which is of as important as it is sensational, and that they only await the impending issue of a known litigation in the probate court to effect an arrest. The Dublin public flocked to the court to hear the arguments of the case with ease. I myself journeyed down to Dublin, and as soon as I succeeded in finding my way into a densely crowded court, I took stock of the various actors of the drama, which I was a spectator and prepared to enjoy. There were Percival Brooks and Murray, his brother, the two litigants, both good-looking and well-dressed, and both striving, by keeping up the running conversation with their lawyer, to appear unconcerned and confident of their issue. With Percival Brooks was Henry Arnmore, the eminent Irish K.C., whilst Herbert Wilwert, a rising barrister, the son of Wilson Hibbert, appeared from Murray. The will of which the later claimed probate was one dated 1891, had been made by Mr. Brooks during a severe illness which threatened to end his days. This will had been deposed by the hands of Messrs. Weathered and Hibbert, solicitors of the deceased, and by it Mr. Brooks left his personally quartered divided between his two sons, but had left his business entirely to his youngest son, with a charge of £2,000 a year upon it, payable to Percival. You see that Murray Brooks, therefore, had a very deep interest in that second will being found null and void. Old Mr. Hibbert had very ably instructed his son, and Walter Hibbert's opening speech was exceedingly clever. He would show, he said, on behalf of his client, that the will dated December 1st, 1900, could never have been made by the late Mr. Brooks, as it was absolutely contrary to his avowed intentions, and that if the late Mr. Brooks did on the day in question make any fresh will at all, it certainly was not the one proved by Mr. Percival Brooks, and that was absolutely a forgery from beginning to end. Mr. Walter Hibbert proposed to call several witnesses in support of both of these points. On the other hand, Mr. Henry Oranmore, K.C., very ably and courteously replied that he too had several witnesses to prove that Mr. Brooks certainly did make a will on the day in question, and that whatever his intentions may have been in the past, he must have modified them the day of his death. For the will proved by Mr. Percival Brooks found that after the death under the pillow, duly signed and witnessed in every way legal. Then the battle began in sober earnest. It chiefly centered around the prosaic figure of John O'Neill, the butler of Fitzwilliam Place, who had been in Mr. Brooks's family for 30 years. "I was clearing away the breakfast things," said John. "Then I heard the master's voice and study close by. Oh my, he was angry. I could hear the words disgrace and villain and liar and ballet dancer, and one or two of the ugly words that applied to some female lady, which I would not like to repeat. At first I did not take much notice, as I was quite used to hearing my poor dear master having words with Miss Percival. So I went downstairs carrying my breakfast things, but I had just started cleaning my silver when the study bell goes ringing violently, and I hear Mr. Percival's voice shouting in the hall, 'John, John, quick, send for Dr. Mulligan at once. Your master is not well. Send one of the men, and you come up and help me get Mr. Brooks to the bed.' I sent one of the grooms for the doctor," continued John, who seemed still affected at the recollection of his poor master, to whom he had evidently been very much attached. "And I went up to see Mr. Brooks. I found him lying on the study floor, and his head supported on Mr. Percival's arms. 'My father had fallen in a faint,' said the young master. 'Help me to get him up to the room before Mr. Mulligan arrives.' Mr. Percival looked quite upset, which was only natural, and when he had got the poor master to bed, I asked if I should not go and break the news to Mr. Murray, who had gone to business an hour ago. However, before Mr. Percival had had time to give me an order, the doctor came. I thought I had seen plainly death written in the master's face, and when I showed the doctor out an hour later, he told me that he would be back directly. I knew that the end was near. Mr. Brooks rang me for a minute or two later. He told me to send for once at Mr. Weathered, or else for Mr. Hibbert, if Mr. Weathered could not come. 'I haven't many hours to live, John,' he says to me. 'My heart is broke, and the doctor says my heart is broke. A man shouldn't marry and have children, John, for they will sooner or later break his heart.' I was so upset I couldn't speak. I went round at once for Mr. Weathered, who came himself about 3 o'clock that afternoon. After he had been in my master about an hour, I was called in, and Mr. Weathered said to me that Mr. Brooks wished me and one other of the servants to witness that he had signed a paper which was on the table by the bedside. I called Pat Mooney, the head of the footmen, and before us both Mr. Brooks put his name at the bottom of the paper. Then Mr. Weathered gave me the pen and told me to write my name as witness, and that Pat Mooney was to do the same. After that, we were both told that we could go. He was present on the following day when the undertakers, who had come to the master out, found a paper underneath the pillow. John O'Neill, who recognized the paper as the one which he had printed his signature on the day before, took it to Mr. Percival and gave it into his hands. In answer to Mr. Walter Hibbert, John asserted positively that he took the paper from the undertaker's hand and went straight with it to Mr. Percival's room. "He was alone," said John. "I gave him the paper, just as he glanced at it, and I thought he looked rather astonished, but he said nothing, and I at once left the room." "When you say that he recognized the paper as one which you had seen your master sign the day before, how did you actually recognize it as it was the same paper?" asked Mr. Hibbert, amidst breathless interest on part of the spectators. "I narrowly observed the witness's face." "It looked exactly the same paper to me, sir," replied John somewhat vaguely. "Did you look at the contents, then?" "No, sir, certainly not." "Had you done so the day before?" "No, sir, only at my master's signature." "Then you only thought, by the look outside of the paper, that it was the same?" "It looked like the same thing, sir," persisted John obstinately. "You see," continued the man in the corner, leaning eagerly forward across the narrow marble table, "the contention of Murray Brooks' adviser was that Mr. Brooks, having made a will and hidden it for some reason or other under his pillow, that the will had fallen, through the means related to John O'Neill, into the hands of Mr. Percival Brooks, who destroyed it and substituted a forged one in its place, which judged the whole of Mr. Brooks's millions to himself. It was a terrible and very daring accusation directed against a gentleman who, in spite of his many wild oats sown in the early youth, was a prominent and important figure in the Irish high life. All those present were aghast at what they heard, and the whispered comments I could hear around me showed that the public opinion at least did not uphold Mr. Murray Brooks's daring accusation against his brother. But John O'Neill had not finished his evidence, and Mr. Walter Hibbert had a bit of sensation still up his sleeve. He had, namely, produced a paper, and he asked John O'Neill if once again he recognized the paper. "Certainly, sir," said John unhesitatingly. "That is the one the undertaker found under the pillow of my poor master, and which I took to Percival's room immediately." Then the paper was unfolded and placed before the witness. "Now, Mr. O'Neill, you will tell me that is your signature." John looked at it for a moment, then he said, "Excuse me, sir," and produced a pair of spectacles, which he carefully adjusted before again examining the paper. Then he thoughtfully shook his head. "Don't look much like my writing, sir," he said at last. "Say that is to say," he added, by way of elucidating the matter, "it does look like my writing, but then I don't think it is." "There was a moment, a look in Mr. Percival's face," continued the man in the corner quietly, "which then and there gave me the whole history of the quarrel, the illness of Mr. Brooks, and the will. Aye, and the murder of Patrick Weatherd, too. All I wondered at then was how every one of those learned counsel on both sides did not get the clue just the same as I did. It went on arguing, speechifying, cross-examining for nearly a week, until they arrived at the one conclusion which was inevitable from the very first, namely, that the will was a forgery. A gross, clumsy, idiotic forgery, since both John O'Neill and Pat Mooney, the two witnesses, absolutely repudiated their signatures and their own. The only successful bit of calligraphy the forger had done was the signature of old Mr. Brooks. It was a very curious fact, and one which had undoubtedly aided the forger in accomplishing his works quickly. That Mr. Weatherd, the lawyer, having no doubt realized that Mr. Brooks had not so many moments in life to spare, had not drawn up a usual engrossed, magnificent document dear to the lawyer heart, but had used the client's will, one of those regular printed forms which can be purchased at any stationery's. Mr. Percival Brooks, of course, flatly denied the serious allegation brought against him. He admitted that the butler had brought him the document the morning after his father's death, and that he certainly, on glancing at it, had been very astonished to see that the document was his father's will. Against that he declared that its contents did not astonish him in the slightest degree, that he himself knew of the traitor's intentions, but that he certainly thought his father had entrusted the will to the care of Mr. Weatherd, who did all his business for him. "I'm only curiously against the signature," he concluded, speaking in a perfectly calm and clear voice. "You must understand that I thought the forgery was very far from my mind, and my father's signature was exceedingly well imitated, if indeed it is not his own, which I am not at all prepared to believe. As for the two witnesses' signatures, I don't think I had ever seen them before. I took the documents to Messrs. Barkson and Maud, who had often done business with me before, and they assured me that it was perfect form and in order. Asked why he had not entrusted the will to his father's solicitors, he replied, "For the very simple reason that exactly half an hour before the will was placed in my hands, I had read that Mr. Patrick Merritt had been murdered the night before. Mr. Hibbert, the junior partner, was not personally known to me." After that, for form's sake, a good deal of expert evidence was heard on the subject of the dead man's signature. But that was quite unanimous, and merely went to corroborate what had already been established beyond a doubt. Namely, the will dated December 1st, 1900, was a forgery, and probate of the will dated 1891 was therefore granted to Mr. Murray Brooks, the sole executor of mentioned to them. I keep saying executor, but this executor and Exeter. No, executor. English. Why did you do that to people? Executor and executor. Such a pain. Anyway, part 3. 2 days later, the police applied for a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Percival Brooks on a charge of forgery. The Crown prosecuted, and Mr. Brooks had again the support of Mr. Ormeyer, the eminent K.C. Perfectly calm, like a man conscious of his own innocence and unable to grasp the idea that justice does sometimes miscarry, Mr. Brooks, the son of the millionaire, himself still the prisoner of a very large fortune, under the former will, stood up in the dock on that memorable day of May 1902, which still no doubt lives in the memory of many of his friends. All the evidence with regard to Mr. Brooks' last moments in the forged will was gone through over again. That will, it was the contention of the Crown, had been forged so entirely in favor of the accused, cutting out everyone else, that obviously no one but the beneficiary under that false will would have had any motive in forging it. Very pale, and with a frown between his deep-set, handsome Irish eyes, Percival Brooks listened to this large volume of evidence piled up against him by the Crown. At times he held brief consultations with Mr. Ormer, who seemed cool as a cucumber. Have you seen the Ormer in court? He is a character worthy of Dickens. His pronounced brogue, his fat, podgy, clean-shaven cheeks, his not always immaculately clean large hands, and often delighted the caricaturist. As it was very soon transpired that memorable magisterial inquiry, he relied for a verdict in favor of his client upon 2 main points, and he had concentrated all his skill upon making those 2 points as telling as he possibly could. The first point was a question of time. John O'Neill, cross-examined by Ormore, stated without hesitation that he had given the will to Mr. Percival at 11 o'clock in the morning. And now the eminent K.C. brought forward and placed in the witnesses' box the very lawyers into whose hands the accused had then immediately placed the will. Now Mr. Barkston, a very well-known solicitor of King Street, declared positively that Mr. Percival Brooks was in his office at a quarter before 12. Two of his clerks testified at the exact same time, and it was impossible, continued Mr. Oranmore, that within 3/4 of an hour Mr. Brooks could have gone from the station in his brought will form, copied Mr. Wethering's writing, his father's signature, and that of John O'Neill and Pat Rooney. Such a thing might have been planned, arranged, practiced, or ultimately, after a great deal of trouble, successfully carried out. But human intelligence could not grasp the other as a possibility. Still, the judge wavered. The eminent K.C. had shaken but not shattered his belief in the prisoner's guilt. But there was one more point, and this Oranmore, with the skill of a dramatist, had reserved for the fall of the curtain. He noted every sign in the judge's face. He guessed that his client had not yet been absolutely safe. Then only did he produce his last two witnesses. One of them was Mary Sullivan, one of the housemaids in the Fitzwilliam mansion. She had been sent up by the cook at 4:15 o'clock in the afternoon of December 1st with some hot water, which the nurse had ordered for the master's room. Just as she was about to knock on the door, Mr. Weatherd was coming out of the room. Mary stopped with a tray in her hand, and at the door Mr. Weatherd turned and said, quite aloud, "Now, don't fret, don't be anxious, don't try and be calm. Your will is safe in my pockets. Nothing can change it, and alter one word of it but yourself." It was, of course, a very ticklish point to the law, whether the housemaid's evidence could be accepted. You see, she was quoting the words of a man since dead, spoken to another man, also dead. There's no doubt that had there been very strong evidence on the other side against Percival Brooks, Mary Sullivan's would have counted for nothing. But I told you that before the judge's belief in the prisoner's guilt was already very seriously shaken, and now the final blow aimed at it by Mr. Oranmore's shattered any last lingering doubts. Dr. Mulligan, namely, was placed into the box by Mr. Oranmore and the witness. He was a medical man of impeccable authority, in fact, absolutely at the head of the profession in Dublin. What he said practically corroborated Mary Sullivan's testimony. He had gone in to see Mr. Brooks at 4:30, and understood from him that his lawyer had just left him. Mr. Brooks certainly, though terribly weak and calm, more composed. He was dying from a sudden attack. Dr. Mulligan foresaw the almost immediate end, but he was still conscious and managed to murmur feebly, "I feel much easier in my mind now, doctor. I have made my will. Whether it has been. He's got it in his pocket. It is safe there. Safe from—" But the words died on his lips. No, after that he spoke but little. He saw his two sons before he died, but hardly knew them or even looked at them. "Off with their heads!" I mean, executor and executor and executor are literally the same word. Why do they have to have two different pronunciations? It's just a pain. Anyway. Part 4. "You see," concluded the man in the corner, "you see that the prosecution was bound to collapse. Oranmore did not give it a leg to stand upon. The will was forged, it is true, forged in favor of Percival Brooks, and of no one else. Forged for him, for his benefit. Whether he knew and connived at the forgery was never proved, for, as far as I know, even himself. But it was impossible to go against the evidence, which pointed that, as far as the act itself was concerned, he at least was the most innocent. You see, Dr. Mulligan's evidence was not to be shaken. Mary Sullivan's was equally strong. There were 2 witnesses swearing positively that old Brooks' will was in Mr. Weathered's keeping when that gentleman left Fitzwarren Mansion at the 4:15. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the lawyer was found dead in Phoenix Park. Between 4:15 and 8 o'clock in the evening, Percival Brooks never left the house, and was subsequently proved by Ormore beyond a doubt. Since the will found under Brooks's pillow was a forged will, where then was the will he did make, and Weathered carried away with him in his pocket? Stolen, of course, I said. By those who murdered and robbed him. It may have been no value to them, and they naturally would destroy it, lest it was proven a clue against him. Then you think it was mere coincidence? He asked excitedly. What? That Weathered was murdered and robbed at the very moment that he carried the will in his pocket while another was being forged in its place. It certainly would be very curious if it were a mere coincidence, I said musingly. Very, he repeated with biting sarcasm, whilst nervously his bony fingers played with the inevitable bit of string. Very curious indeed. Just think of the whole thing. There was the old man with all his wealth, the 2 sons, one of whom he is devoted, and the other with whom he does nothing but quarrel. One day there is another of these quarrels, but more violent, more terrible than any had previously occurred, with the result that the father, heartbroken by it all, has an attack of the heart, practically dies of a broken heart. After that he alters his will, and subsequently a will is proved which turns out to be a forgery. Now everybody, police, press, and the public alike, once jumped to the conclusion that, as Percival Brooks benefits the forged will, Percival Brooks must be the forger. Seek for him who the crime benefits, is your own axiom, I argued. I beg your pardon? Percival Brooks benefited to the tune of £2 million. I beg your pardon, he did nothing of the sort. He was left with less than half the share that his younger brother inherited. Now, yes, but that was the former will, and that forged will was so clumsily executed, the signature so carelessly imitated, that the forgery was bound to come to light. Did that ever strike you? Yes, but... There is no but, he interrupted. It was always clear as daylight to me from the very first. The quarrel with the old man which broke his heart was not with his eldest son, with whom he was so used to quarreling, but with a second son whom he idolized and whom he believed. Don't you remember how John O'Neill heard the words liar and deceit? Percival Brooks never deceived his father. His sins were all on the surface. Murray had led the quiet life and pandered to his father and fawned upon him until, like most hypocrites, he was last found out. Who knows what ugly gambling debt or debt of honor suddenly revealed to old Brooks? What's the cause of the last and deadly quarrel? You remember that it was Percival who remained beside the father and carried him up to his room. Where was Murray through that long, painful day? When his father lay, dying, he, the idolized son, the apple of the old man's eye. You never hear the name mentioned as being present there that day. But he knew that all had offended his father mortally, and that his father meant to cut him off without a shilling. He knew that Mr. Weathered had been sent for, and that Weathered left the house soon after 4 o'clock. And there the cleverness of man comes in. Having lain in wait Weathered, knocked him on the back of the head with a stick. They could not very well make that will disappear altogether. There remained the faint chance of some other witnesses knowing that Mr. Brooks had made a fresh will. Mr. Weathered's partner, his clerk, or one of those confidential servants in the house. Therefore, a will must be discovered after the old man's death. Now, Murray Brooks is not an expert forger. It takes years of training to become that. A forged will executed by himself would be sure to be found out. Yes, that's it, sure to be found out. A forgery will be palpable. let it be palpable, and then it will be found out, branded as such, and the original will of 1891, so favorable in the young blackguard's interest, will be held as valid. It was devilry, and merely an additional caution which prompted Murray to pen the forged will so glaringly in Percival's favor. It is impossible to say. Anyhow, it was the cleverest touch that the marvelously devised crime. The plan that evil deed was great. To execute it was easy enough. He had several hours' leisure in which to do it. Then at night it was simplicity itself to slip the document on the dead man's pillow. Sacrilege causes no shudder to such natures as Murray Brooks. The rest of the drama you already know. But Percival Brooks... The jury returned a verdict of not guilty. There was no evidence against him. But the money... Surely the scoundrel does not still have the enjoyment of it. No, he enjoyed it for a time, but he died about 3 months ago, and forgot to take the precaution of making a will, so his brother Percival has got the business after all. If you ever go to Dublin, I should order some of Brooks' bacon if I were you. It is very good. So, ordering a will so badly that it's going to draw attention. I guess that works fine. So if you're ever going to make a fake will, don't put it in favor of you. Man, that's just... An argument with the younger son that just literally vanishes throughout the rest of the story. uh... That's definitely clever. Okay. It's only 10:30 something. Let me see what the 6 story is. It is only 10 pages. Of course, so Dublin is only 9, so... So let's... Go ahead and get the story done. Sorry for the coughing. But our last story for tonight, the Birmingham Mystery. The man in the corner rubbed his chin thoughtfully and looked out upon the busy street below. I suppose, he said, there's some truth in the saying that the Providence watches over bankrupts, kittens, and lawyers. I didn't know there was such a thing as saying, I replied, with a guarded dignity. Isn't there? Perhaps I'm misquoting. Anyway, there should be. Kittens, it seems, live and thrive through social and domestic upheavals which would annihilate the self-supporting tomcat. And today I read the morning papers at the account of a noble lord's bankruptcy, and in the social ones that his visits at the house of cabinet minister, where he is the most honored guest. As for lawyers, when Providence had exhausted all other means of securing their welfare, it has brought forth the peerage cases. I believe, as a matter of fact, that the special dispensation of Providence, as you call it, requires more technical knowledge than any other legal complication that comes before the law courts, I said. and also a great deal more money in the client's pocket than any other complication. Now, take the Lockspeed percentage case. Have you any idea how much money was sent over the soap bubble, which only burst after many hundreds, if not thousands of pounds went into lawyers' and counsel's fees? I suppose a great deal of money was spent on both sides, I said, until that sudden, awful issue. Which settled the dispute effectively, he interrupted with a dry chuckle. Of course, it is doubtful that any reputable solicitor had taken up the case. Timothy Bedingfield, the Birmingham lawyer, is a gentleman who, well, has had some misfortune, shall we say. He is still on the rolls, mind you, but I doubt if any case would have its chances improved by his conducting it. Against that, there is just this to be said. Some of these old peerages have such peculiar histories and own such wonderful archives that the claim is always worth investigating. You never know what may be the rights of it. I believe that, at first, everyone laughed over the pretensions of the Honourable Ron Ingram de Grimsville to the joint of the part revenues of the old barony of Grimsville, but obviously he might have got his case. It certainly sounded almost like a fairy tale, a claim based upon the supposed validity of an ancient document over 400 years old. It was then that a medieval Lord de Genville, more endowed with muscle than common sense, became during his turbulent existence much embarrassed and hopelessly puzzled through the presentation made to him by his lady of twin-born sons. His embarrassment chiefly arose from the fact that the lady's attendants, while ministering the comforts of the mother, had, in a moment of absent-mindedness, so placed 2 infants under their cots that subsequently not one, not even, perhaps least of all, the mother, could tell which one was which, had been first to make his appearance into this troublesome and puzzling world. After many years of cogitation, during which the Lord de Gainesville approached nearer to the grave and his sons to a man's estate, he gave up trying to solve the riddle as to which of the twins should succeed in his title and revenues. He appealed to his liege lord and King Edward IV of that name, and with the latter's august sanction he drew up a certain document wherein he enacted that both his sons should, after his death, share his titles and godly revenues, and that the first son born in wedlock of either father should subsequently be the sole heir. In this document was also added that if the future time should any Lord de Guerin be similarly affected with twin sons, who had equal rights to be considered the eldest son, the same rule should apply in his succession. Subsequently, Lord de Guinevere was created Earl of Brocklesby by one of the Stuart kings, but 400 years after its enacted the extraordinary deed of succession remained a mere tradition. The Countesses of Brocklesby having seemingly no prediction for twins. But in 1878, the mistress of Brocklesby Castle presented her lord with 2 twin-born sons. Fortunately, in modern times, science is more wide awake and attendants more careful. Twin brothers did not get mixed up, and one of them was styled Viscount Termont, and the other was heir to the earldom, whilst the other, born 2 hours later, was that fascinating, dashing young guardsman, well known at Hurlington, Goodwood, and London, and in his own country, the Honourable Robert Ingram de Guinevere. It certainly was an evil day for the brilliant young scion of the ancient race when he lent an ear to Timothy Bedingfield. This man, and his family before him, had been solicitors of the Earls of Brocklesby for many generations, but Timothy, owing his certain irregularities, had forfeited the confidence of his client, the late Earl. He was still in practice at Birmingham, however, and, of course, knew the ancient family tradition of twin succession. Whether he was prompted by revenge or merely self-advertisement, no one knows. Certain it is that he did advise the Honorable Robert Genville, who apparently had more debts than he conveniently could pay, and more extravagant tastes than he could gratify on a younger portions, to lay a claim on his father's death unto the joint title of moiety of the revenues of the ancient barony of Grenville, that claim being based upon the validity of the 15th century document. You may gather how extensive were the pretensions of the Honorable Roberts from the fact that the greater part of Edinburgh is now built upon the land belonging to the old barony. Anyway, it is the last straw of the ocean of debts and difficulties, and I have no doubt that Bedingfield had not much trouble in persuading the Honorable Roberts to commence litigation at once. The young Earl of Brockingsley's attitude, however, remained one of absolute quietude in his 9 points of the law. He was in possession of both the title and of the document. It was for one side of the force to produce the one to share the other. It was at this stage of the proceedings that the Honorable Roberts had advised to marry, in order to secure, if possible, the first male heir of the generation, since the young Earl himself was still a bachelor. A suitable fiancée was found for him by his friends in the person of Miss Mabel Brandon, the daughter of a rich Birmingham manufacturer, and the marriage was fixed to take place at Birmingham on Thursday, September 15th. On the 13th, the Honorable Robert Ingram de General arrived at the Castle Hotel on New Street for his wedding, and on the 14th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, he was discovered lying on the floor of his bedroom, murdered. The sensation in which the awful and unexpected sequel to the de Geneville peerage caused the minds of the friends of both litigants was a crime unparalleled. I don't think the crime of modern times created such a stir in all classes of society. Birmingham was wild with excitement. The employees of the Castle Hotel had real difficulty in keeping off any eager, inquisitive crowd who thronged daily to the hall, vainly hoping to gather details of news gathering to the related tragedy. At present, there was little to tell. The shrieks of the chambermaid who had gone into the Honorable Robert's room with his shaving water at 8 o'clock had attracted some of the waiters. Soon the manager and his secretary came up, and immediately sent for the police. It seemed at first sight as if the young man had been the victim of a homicidal maniac, so brutal had been the way in which he had been assassinated. The head and body were battered and bruised by some heavy stick or poker, almost past human shape, as if the murderer had wished to wreak some awful vengeance upon the body of the victim. In fact, it would be impossible to recount the gruesome aspect of that room and of any murdered man's body, such as the police and the medical officer took notes of that day. It was supposed that the murder had been committed before the evening. The victim was dressing in his evening clothes, and all the lights in the room had been left on. Robbery also must have had a share in the miscreant's motives, for the drawers and cupboards of the portmanteau and dressing bag had been ransacked as if in search of valuables. On the floor there lay a pocket-book, torn in half and only containing a few letters addressed to the Honorable Robert de Geneville. The Earl of Brocklesby, next of kin to the deceased, was also telegraphed for. He drove from Broxley Castle, which was about 7 miles from Birmingham. He was terribly afflicted by the awfulness of the tragedy, and offered a liberal reward to stimulate the activity of the police in search of the miscreants. The inquest was fixed for the 17th, 3 days later, and the public was left wondering where the solution lay in the terrible and gruesome murder of the Castle Hotel. Part 2. The central figure of the coroner's court that day was undoubtedly the Earl of Brocklesby, in deep black, which constrained strongly his florid complexion and his fair hair. Sir Marmaduke Ingersoll, his solicitor, was with him, and had already performed the painful duty of identifying the deceased with his brother. This had been an exceedingly painful duty owing to the terrible mutilated state of the body and the face. But the clothes and various trinkets he wore, including a signet ring, had unfortunately not tempered the brutal assassin, and it was through them chiefly that Lord Brocklesby was able to swear to the identity of his brother. The various employees of the hotel gave evidence as to the discovery of the body, and the medical officer gave his opinion as to the immediate cause of death. The deceased had evidently been struck at the back of the head with a poker or very heavy stick. The murderer then venting his blind fury upon the body, battering his face and bruising it in a way that certainly suggested the work of a maniac. Then Earl of Brocklesby was called, and requested by the coroner to state when he had last seen his brother alive. The morning before his death, replied his lordship. He came up to Birmingham by early train, and I drove up from Brocklesby to see him. I got to the hotel at 11 o'clock and stayed with him for about an hour. And that is the last you saw of the deceased? That is the last I saw of him, replied Lord Brocklesby. He seemed to hesitate for a moment or two, as if in thought whether he should speak up or not, and then to suddenly make up his mind to speak, for he added, I stayed in town the whole of the next day, and only drove back to Brocklesby late in the evening. I had some business to transact, and put up the Grand, as I usually do, and dined with some friends. Would you tell us by what time you returned to Brocklesby Castle? I think it must have been about 11 o'clock. It is a 7-mile drive from here. I believe, said the coroner after a slight pause, during which the attention of all of the spectators was riveted upon the handsome figure of the young man as he stood in the witness box, the very personification of a high-bred gentleman. I believe that I'm right in stating that there was an unfortunate legal dispute between your lordship and your brother. That is so. The coroner stroked his chin thoughtfully for a moment, then added, in the event of the deceased's claim to the joint title and revenues of the Dinnerville being good held in the courts of law, there would be great importance, would there not, attached to his marriage, which was to have taken place on the 15th. It is, in that event, there certainly would be. Is the jury to understand, then, that you and the deceased parted on amicable terms after your interview with him? The Earl of Brocklesby hesitated again for a moment or two. The crowd of the jury hung breathless upon his lips. There's no enmity between us, he replied at last. From which we may gather that there might have been, shall I say, a slight disagreement at the interview. My brother had unfortunately been misled by the misrepresentations and perhaps too optimistic views of his lawyer. He had been dragged into litigation on the strength of an old family document which he had never seen, or moreover is antiquated, and owing to certain wording in it invalid, I thought it would be kinder and more considerate, therefore, to let my brother judge of the document himself. I knew that when he had seen it, he would be convinced of the absolute futility and basis of his claim, and that it would be a terrible disappointment to him. That this is the reason why I wish to see him myself about it, rather than to do it through more formal, perhaps more correct, medium of our respective lawyers. I placed the facts before him, and with my part, a perfectly amicable spirit. The young Earl of Bartleby had made this somewhat lengthy, perfectly voluntary explanation of the state of affairs in a calm, quiet voice, with much dignity and perfect simplicity. But the coroner did not seem impressed by it, for he asked, very dryly, Did you part as friends? On my side, absolutely so. But not his, insisted the coroner. I think he felt naturally annoyed by that he had been so ill-advised by his solicitors. And you made no attempts later on in the day to adjust any ill feeling that you may have existed between you and him? Asked the coroner, marking with strange, earnest emphasis on every word he uttered. If you mean did I go and see my brother again that day, no, I did not. And your lordship, Can you give us no further information which might throw some light upon the mystery which surrounds the Honorable Robert Grenville's death? Still persisted the coroner. I'm sorry, I cannot, replied Earl Broxley with firm decision. The coroner still looked puzzled and thoughtful. It seemed at first as if he wished to press the point further. Everyone felt some deep import had been lain behind this examination of the witness, but all were tentative hooks as to what evidence might bring forth. The Earl of Brockelsby had waited a minute or two, and then, at a sign from the coroner, had left the witness box in order to have a talk with his solicitor. At first he paid no attention to the depositions of the cashier and the hall porter of the Castle Hotel. Gradually it seemed to strike him that curious statements were being made by these witnesses, and a frown of anxious wonder had settled upon his brows, whilst his young face lost some of its florid hue. Mr. Tremlett, the cashier of the hotel, had been holding the attention of the court. He stated that the Honorable Robert Ingram de Grenville had arrived at the hotel at 8 o'clock on the morning of the 13th. He had the room which was usually occupied when he came to the castle, namely number 21, and he went up immediately on his arrival, ordering some breakfast to be brought up to him. At 11 o'clock the Earl of Brockelsby called to see his brother, and remained with him until about 12. In the afternoon the deceased went out and returned for his dinner at 7 o'clock, in company of a gentleman whom the cashier knew well by sight, Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, the lawyer of Paradise Street. The gentlemen had their dinner downstairs, and after that they went up to the Honorable Mr. de Grenville's room for coffee and cigars. I could not say at the time Mr. Bedingfield left the cashier, but I rather fancy I saw him in the hall about 9:15 p.m. He was wearing an Inverness cape over his dress clothes and a Glengarry cap. It was just at the hour of the visitors who come down as for the night from London. They were arriving thick and fast. The hall was very full, and there was a large party of Americans monopolizing most of the personnel. So I could not swear positively whether I did see Mr. Bedingfield or not then, though I'm quite sure that it was Mr. Timothy Bedingfield who dined and spent the evening with the Honorable Mr. de Grenville, as I know him quite well by sight. At 10 o'clock I'm off duty, and the night porter remains alone in the hall. Mr. Tremlett's evidence was corroborated in most respects by the waiter-nark of the hall porter. They had both seen the deceased come in at 7 o'clock in company with a gentleman. Their descriptions of the latter coincided with the appearance of Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, whom, however, they did not actually know. At this point in the proceedings, the foreman of the jury wished to know why Mr. Timothy Bedingfield's evidence had not been obtained, and was informed by the detective inspector in charge of the case that the gentleman had seemingly left Birmingham, but was expected sometime shortly. The coroner suggested an adjournment pending Mr. Bedingfield's appearance, but at the earnest request of the detective he consented to hear the evidence of Peter Tyrrell, the night porter of the Castle Hotel, who, if you remember, case at all, succeeded in creating the biggest sensation of any which had been made through the extraordinary and weirdly gruesome case. It was the first time I had been on duty at the castle, he said, for I used to be the night porter at Brights and Walpurton. But just as I had come to duty at 10 o'clock, a gentleman came and asked if he could see the Honorable Robert de Grenville. I said that I thought he was in, but would send up to see. The gentleman said, "It doesn't matter. Don't trouble. I know his room. 21, isn't it?" And up he went before I could say another word. Did he give you any name? Said the coroner. No, sir. What was he like? A young gentleman, sir, as far as I can remember. An Inverness cape and a Glengarry cap. But I could not see his face very well as he stood back in the lights, and the cap shaded his eyes. He only spoke to me for a minute. Look around you, said the coroner quietly. Is there anyone in this court who looks like the gentleman you speak of? An odd hush fell over the many spectators that are present at Peter Tyrrell, the night porter of the Castle Hotel. turned his head towards the body of the court and slowly scanned the many faces there present. For a moment he seemed to hesitate. Only for a moment, though. Then was vaguely conscious of a terrible importance his next words might have. He shook his head gravely and said, "I wouldn't like to swear." Coroner tried to press him. "A true British solidities," he repeated. "I wouldn't like to say." "Well, then, what happened?" asked the coroner, who had a preforce to abandon his points. "The gentleman went upstairs, sir, and about a quarter of an hour later he came down again, and I let him out. He was in a great hurry then, and he threw me a half-crown and said good night." "And though you saw him again, you cannot tell us you would know him?" Once more the hall porter's eyes wandered as if instinctively to a certain face in the court. Once more he hesitated for many seconds, which seems like so many hours during a man's honor. A man's life hung, perhaps, in the balance. Then Peter Tyrrell repeated slowly, "I wouldn't swear." But the coroner and the jury alike, aye, and every spectator in the crowded court, had seen the man's eyes had rested during that one moment of hesitation upon the face of the Earl of Broxley. Part 3. The man in the corner blinked with his funny, mild blue eyes. "No wonder you're puzzled," he continued. "So was everybody in the court that day, everyone save myself. I alone could see in my mind's eye with that gruesome murder which had been committed, with all its details and, above all, its motive, and such as you will see it presently, when I place it all clearly before you. Before this, you must see the daylights in the strange case. I must plunge you further into the darkness, in the same manner as the coroner and the jury were plunged into that following day. The second day of that quite remarkable inquest. I had it to be adjourned, since the appearance of Mr. Timothy Bedingfield had now become of vital importance. The public had come to regard his absence from Birmingham at this very critical moment to be decidedly remarkable, to say the least of it, and all those that did not know the lawyer by sight wished to see him, and his Inverness cape and Glengarry cap, such as he had appeared before the several witnesses of the night of the awful murder. When the coroner and the jury were seated, the first piece of information which the police placed before them was the astonishing statement that Mr. Timothy Bedingfield's whereabouts had not been ascertained, though it was confidentially expected that he had not gone far and could easily be traced. There was a witness present who, the police thought, might throw some light upon the lawyer's probable destination, for obviously he had left Birmingham directly after his interview with the deceased. This witness was Mrs. Higgins, who was Mr. Bedingfield's housekeeper. She stated that her master was in the constant habit, especially lately, of going up to London on business. He usually left by a late evening train on those occasions, and mostly was only absent 36 hours. He kept a portmanteau always ready packed for the purpose. He often left at a moment's notice. Mrs. Higgins added that her master stayed at the Great Western Hotel in London, for it was there that she was instructed to wire, if anything urgent required his presence in Birmingham. "On the night of the 14th, she continued, "at 9 o'clock or thereabouts, a messenger came to the door with the master's card, and said that he had been instructed to fetch Mr. Bedington's portmanteau, and then to meet him at the station in time to catch the 9:35 train up. I gave him the portmanteau, of course, and he had brought the card, and I had no idea that where he could be anything wrong. But since then I heard nothing of my master, and I don't know when he will return." Questioned by the coroner, she added that Mr. Bedingfield had never stayed away quite so long without having his letters forwarded to him. There was a large pile waiting for him now. She had written to the Great Western Hotel, London, asking that she should do about the letters, but had received no reply. She did not know the messenger by sight who had been called by the portmanteau. Once or twice before, Mr. Bedingfield had sent for his things in that manner when he had been dining out. Mr. Bedingfield certainly wore his Inverness cape over his dress clothes, and when he went out about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, he also wore a Glengarry cap. The messenger had so far not been found. From this point, namely, the sending of the portmanteau, all traces of Mr. Timothy Bedingfield seemed to have been lost. Whether he went up to London by the 9:35 train or not could not be definitely ascertained. The police had questioned at least a dozen porters of the railway, as well as ticket collectors, but no one had had any special recollection of a gentleman in an Inverness cape and a Glengarry cap, a costume worn by more than one first-class passenger on a cold night in September. There was a hitch, you see. It all lay in this. Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, the lawyer, had undoubtedly made himself scarce. He was last seen in the company of the deceased, wearing an Inverness cape and Glengarry cap. 2 or 3 witnesses saw him leaving the hotel at about 9:15. Then the messenger calls on the lawyer's house for the portmanteau, after which Mr. Timothy Bedingfield seems to have vanished into thin air. But, and that is a great but, the night porter at the castle seems to have seen someone wearing the momentous Inverness and Glengarry half an hour or so later, and going up to the deceased room, where he stayed about a quarter of an hour. Undoubtedly, you will say, as everyone said to themselves that day after the night porter and Mr. Higgins had been heard, that there was a very ugly and very black figure which pointed unpleasantly at Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, especially as that gentleman, for some reason which was required an explanation, was not there to put matters right for himself. But there was one little thing, a mere trifle perhaps, which neither the coroner nor the jury dared to overlook, for strictly speaking, it was not an evidence. You will remember that, when the night porter was asked if he could, among the persons present in the court, recognize the Honourable Robert Gineville's belated visitor, everyone had noticed his hesitation, and marked that man's eyes rested doubtingly upon the face of the figure of the young Earl of Brocklesby. Now, if the belated visitor had been Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, tall, lean, dry as dust, and a bird-like beak and clean-shaven chin, no one for a moment would have mistaken his face, even if they had only seen very casually or recollected it very dimly, with that of the Lord Brocklesby, who was florid and rather short. The only point in common between them was their Saxon hair. You see, that was a curious point, don't you? Added the man in the corner, who had now become so excited that his fingers worked like long, thin needles in and around this bit of string. It weighed very heavily in favor of Timothy Bedingfield, added to which you must also remember that, as far as he was concerned, the Honourable Robert de Benville was to him a goose with the golden eggs. The Honourable de Gineville peerage case had brought Bedingfield's name to great prominence. With the death of his claimants, hopes of prolonging the litigation came to an end. There was a total lack of motive so far as Bedingfield was concerned. Not so with the Earl of Brocklesby, I said. I've often maintained— What? Interrupted. That the Earl of Brockleton's changed his clothes with Bennington in order to more conveniently murder his own brother. Where and when can the exchange of costume have affected, considering the Inverness cape and the Glengarry cap were in the full of the Castle Hotel at 9:15, and at the hotel until 10 o'clock Lord Becklesby was at the Grand Hotel, finishing dinner with some friends. That was subsequently proven, remember, and also that he was back at Brocklesby Castle, which is 7 miles from Birmingham, at 11 o'clock sharp. Now, the visit of the individual in Glengarry occurred some time after 10 p.m. Then there was the disappearance of Bedingfield, I mused. Those certainly points very strong to him. He was very good at practice, I believe, and fairly well known. And yet see how simple it is, cried my friend. Only the police would not look further than these 2 men, Lord Brocklesby with the strong motive and the night porter's hesitation against him, Bedingfield was out a motive, but with a strong circumstantial evidence and his own disappearance as condemnatory signs. If only they would look at the case as I did, and think a little about the dead as well as the living. If they had remembered that the percentage of the peerage case of the Honorable Robert's debts is the last straw which proved the futile claim. Only that very day did the Earl of Brocklesby had, quietly showing the original ancient document to his brother, persuaded him how futile were his hopes. Who knows how many of the debts contracted, the promises made, and the money borrowed and obtained on the strength of the claim that were mere romance. It had nothing of but ruin, enmity of his brother, and the marriage probably broken off, a wasted life in fact. It is a small wonder, though ill feeling against the Earl of Brocklesby may have been deep. There was hatred, bitter, deadly hatred, against a man whose false promises had led him to a hopeless quagmire. Probably the Honorable Robert owed a great deal of money to Bedingfield, which he later hoped to recoup for the usurious interest, threats of scandals, and whatnot. Think of all that, he added, then tell me if you believe that a stronger motive for the murder such an evil could be found. But what do you suggest is impossible? I said aghast. Allow me, he said. It is more than probable. It is very simple and very easy. The two men were alone together in the Honorable Robert Genville's room after dinner. You, as representing the public, and the police say it's Bedingfield, went away and returned half an hour later in order to kill his client. I said that it was the lawyer who was murdered at 9 o'clock that evening, and that Robert the General, the ruined man and hopeless bankrupt, was the assailant. Then, of course, now you remember, for I have put you on track. The face and the body were battered and bruised, as they were past recognition. Both men were equal height. The hair, which could not alone be discolored or obscured, while both men were in similar color. Then the murderer proceeds to dress the victim in his own clothes. With the utmost care, he places his own rings on the fingers of the dead man, his own watch in the pocket, a gruesome task, but an important one, as though he thoroughly well done. Then he puts himself in the clothes of his victim, and finally the Inverness Cape and Glengarry. When the hall is full of visitors, he slips out unperceived. He sends for messengers to Bennington's portmanteau and starts out for the night express. But then his visit to the Castle Hotel at 10 o'clock, I urged. How dangerous. Dangerous? Yes, but oh, how clever. You see, he is the Earl of Brocklesby's twin brother, and the twin brothers are always somewhat alike. He wished to appear dead, murdered by someone, he cared not by whom. But what he did not care about was to throw clouds of dust in the eyes of the police, and he succeeded with a vengeance. Perhaps, who knows, he wished to assure himself that he had forgotten nothing in his mise en scene, that the body, battered and bruised past all resemblance of human shape, save for its clothes, would really appear to everyone as the Honorable Robert Geneville, while the later disappeared forever from the old world and started a new life again. Then you must always reckon that the practical invariable rule of a murderer revisits the scene, if only once, the scene of his crime. 2 years have elapsed since the crime. No trace of Timothy Bedingfield, the lawyer, has ever been found, and I can assure you that it will never be, for his plebeian body lies buried in the aristocratic family vault of the Earls of Brocklesby. He was gone as before. I could say another word. The faces of Timothy Bedingfield, of the Earl of Brocklesby, of the Honorable Robert de Genneville, seemed to dance before my eyes and to mock me, the hopelessness, bewilderment in which I had found myself plunged because of them. Then all the faces vanished, or rather, were merged into one long, thin, bird-like one, with bone-rimmed spectacles on the top of its beak, and a wide, rude grin beneath it, so plunged, still doubtful. I paid for any scanty luncheon that went my way. Man, they're pushing the ads. I've used all of my snoozes to get the story finished before the ads ran. We managed to get through it. So now we'll go back over here. And those were the last of the mysteries of the great cities. So next time it'll be a different author in the same book. I have not seen if anyone has popped up. Oh, let's see who might be. Let's see. Anyone else I see reading? I'll go to my list to see if it's on ASMR. Well, I've seen one other reader that I know is on. Not sure what they're reading. What is Falco reading? The Wolf Leader? This is somewhat appropriate. Of course, I'm in our stream, so I can't really see it. But anyway, those right. It's for everyone. Feel free to pick and choose. Honestly, you can use points to unlock and use either one. Okay. She's doing nice that way. So let's oh well. Now that we're in ads, that's right. Hopefully I spelled it right. Must have, because it's doing the right thing. Okay. So, thank you all for coming in. Again, thank you for the raid and for the subs. And I will hopefully see you all tomorrow night for fairy tales. Possibly frightful fairy tales. We'll see how frightful they will get. Have a good night.